that show cluster messed up time chaotic mess fest we're in.
There ain't nobody gonna do it for you. Got to mind your own.
Okay, now that I've gotten that out of my system, I think I'm ready to start. Hi, friendlies! I'm Carolyn, and welcome back to another episode of As I See It. Are y'all still with me? Stuff's kind of crazy, huh? So I was originally going to do today's video about the Mueller report and the Russia interference, but, you know, like everything else in the last few years, there's just too much going on. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and so instead of talking about the Mueller report and Russia today, which I've been listening to the Mueller report, interesting stuff. Today I want to talk about election rigging. That's right. We're going to talk about election rigging. Last time, if you'll remember, and I'll put a link up here, I talked about voter fraud. But there's been so much going on the last week or so about election interference, election rigging, about voter suppression. There's gerrymandering. There is so much going on that I wanted to talk about that today. And again, in case you're new here, yes, my channel is about my RV life, but it also is now on Tuesdays about things that matter to me, including politics. And so if you don't want to hear politics, if you don't want to hear current events and historical perspective, once again, I'm going to bring history into my talk today about current events. If you don't want to hear that, turn off the video and tune in on Thursday or Sunday for the other stuff, okay, where I don't talk politics. A couple of things that are going on in the news that I thought would make it really critical to talk about this now are efforts by some states to prevent people from voting. There's no other way to say it. And I wanted to talk about these things today because I think it's really important to make sure everybody is aware of what's going on in their states, make sure they're registered to vote, have a plan, early voting, etc. A couple of the stories I'll talk about really quickly, and then we'll get to those toward the end, because I found out a whole bunch of stuff in researching this, just like I normally do. So we're going to talk about history. I've got some really interesting stuff, so subscribe below and stay with me here a minute, okay? But the two or three things in the news this week that really caught my attention. Number one, the Texas governor, who's been going along in his little Texas governorship, Republican Texas governor, he's been going along running the state as a Republican for as long as he's been in office, having voter rules and regulations and strategies and plans in place for as long as he has been in office. And then all of a sudden, a few days ago, out of the blue, he decided that he was going to close voting boxes. So, you know, because of coronavirus, a lot more people don't want to vote in person. There's going to be a shortage of poll workers. The lines are going to be long. We're going to talk all about the different techniques that some states are using to discourage people from voting in all different ways. But because of the coronavirus and because of the gross negligence in handling the coronavirus, we have one of the highest death rates in the world and one of the highest cases in the world. We have no national leadership to help us get better on this, and so a lot of people are afraid to go to the polls. And so vote by mail, absentee ballot, of course, are on the rise. One of the ways, besides the USPS, which has also been jeopardized because of certain people put in charge of it. I think I talked about that in another video. So the ballot boxes. So a lot of people are opting to fill out their ballots and take them to the formal election ballot boxes in their area. Well, Texas had, I don't know, what was it? A whole bunch? All of a sudden, the governor said, nope, we're taking them away. Only one ballot box per county. We're taking away all but one ballot box per county. That means in big counties, that means a rural county that may not be very big is going to have one. A huge city like Austin, or a huge county that Austin is only going to have one. His reasoning is for ballot integrity, that they want to make sure that they have people monitoring the locations to make sure there's no voter fraud. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. But the thing is, he'd already had a plan in place. They already had these ballot boxes opening. They already had people manning these locations to make sure voters felt safe about dropping their... This was already happening. It was already not a problem. He was fixing a problem that didn't need to be fixed. All of a sudden, overnight, he said, nope, we're taking away all the extra drop boxes, and we just have one per county. And that's starting tomorrow. No notice to the voters. It's starting tomorrow. We're taking away all the excess ballot boxes tomorrow. So that's one thing that's going on in the news right now that really made me want to reach out to all of you and let you be aware of this. I don't know what you can do. Get involved. Contact your local ACLU or NAACP or your local legislatures and fight. Write letters. Call. March if you have to. This is blatant voter suppression, right? The other thing that I heard about is in Pennsylvania, once again, Republican-led legislators decided they were going to form a commission to oversee the election. All of a sudden, the election's been going on. They've been fine. Not a lot of voter fraud, like I pointed out in the last video. Voter fraud is minuscule. There is no mass voter fraud. And yet, all of these state legislators are passing what amount to voter suppression laws and rules in order to attack something that doesn't even exist. Talk more about that in a minute. So in Pennsylvania, this Republican-led legislator decided they were going to form a commission to oversee the election process. It's and boy, you know, they created this commission, and 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. They didn't even make it equal. So what does that tell you? They want the power to be able to control. They're going to have subpoena power during the election. They're going to be able to subpoena ballots. I mean, it's just a mess. I'm going to put links in the video description for you to look it up yourself. I'm not going to get into all the details, but it just seems to me that it's another attack on voting, that the Republican-led legislatures are going to be able to wreak chaos on the voting process during the vote counting. They're not allowing the votes to be counted early. You can't start counting until election day. And so this chaos around it's going to take too long to vote, to count the ballots, and then they can interrupt the process through the subpoena power and the supposed oversight power. So those are the 2 things in the news this week that really made me think that there's more here. I want to research it, and I want to share it with you in case you live in any of these states. Some of the other states that are at risk of following this model in Pennsylvania of messing with the elections through an oversight committee that isn't needed are Georgia, Arizona, Florida, and there was another one. I'll get to that in a minute. So if you live in any of those states, you might want to start harassing your legislators and your elected representatives now to make sure they don't do this, because this, to me, is an attack on our voting rights. Okay, there is no reason for this. There's no reason for a separate commission to have to get involved in the counting or an election voting process during the counting of ballots when there is no proof that there is voter fraud. Again, last week I did a video about voter fraud. There's been a lot of screaming about voter fraud from the president since the day he was elected. He claimed in 2016 when he was elected that he actually won the popular vote. Even though he lost the popular vote by 3 million to Hillary Clinton, he came out and said he actually won the popular vote because of the 3 million illegals who were bussed in to vote for Hillary Clinton. Zero proof of that. The talking point is that there is mass, widespread voter fraud. His new talking point is that if he doesn't win, it's because the election is rigged. Does this sound like a democracy to you? Does this sound like something a Democratic leader would tell the populace before an election? He is saying every single day that the the election is rigged if he doesn't win. He has already said he is not committing to a peaceful transfer of power. Is this the America you know? Whether you voted for Trump or not, is this the America you know? Imagine if Obama had said that. Imagine if Barack Obama had said that he can't commit to a peaceful transfer of power. What would you have said? What would you have thought? Would you have accepted it? As now some people are so willing to accept Trump saying that? Do you think that's okay? Do you think it's funny? Do you think it's cute? It's not. This is how democracies die. So excited it got warm in here, I had to change. I had to take off my sweater and put something else on. So I wanted to talk about this whole lie about a rigged election, and I started getting really curious about why all of a sudden, here we are in 2020, we have been, voting in this country for a couple hundred years. Why all of a sudden, why? Just so happens in the last 4 years or 6 years, why all of a sudden is there such an outrage, such a rhetoric about voter fraud? Why? When in fact, why is the really big question when the statistics, when the evidence, when the facts show the opposite? What did I say in the last video? 0.00025% of all ballots or all mail-in ballots, I think they have found voter fraud. In researching this video, I found another statistic that up until 2017 or 2018, 1 billion ballots cast. And there were 31 cases out of 1 billion, 31 cases of voter fraud. So with numbers of voter fraud that small, why is it the topic of conversation of the President of the United States every single day and his minions and state Republican legislatures? Why? So I started digging a little deeper. I found some really interesting things that I want to share with you. So first of all, let's talk about, I wanted this video to be short, and it's not going to be. I was like, I'm dying to get an As I See It video under 40 minutes. So I'm talking really fast to make it go faster. That's not going to work. I'll sip coffee and slow down. Hold on. I didn't think I had the energy to do this. It's kind of late in the afternoon. So I made a cup of coffee, but obviously I don't need it. I'm getting very excited. So why, we have to ask, when we ask ourselves, why all of a sudden this, the elections are rigged, voter fraud is real, why all of a sudden is that an issue when it hasn't been an issue for 200 years? Why all of a sudden is it an issue today? And I think in order to look at why it's an issue today, we have to look at what's the purpose of that? Who benefits from screaming that the elections are rigged, that there's that there's voter fraud, that dead people are voting, that people are getting bussed in from out of the country or out of state to vote? Who benefits from that? And what is the result of that lie? Well, we are seeing in real time the result of that lie are governors pulling out voting booths, or pulling out the boxes to cast your votes. It's looking like legislatures in Pennsylvania saying that they need an oversight committee to oversee the election. It looks like the president rallying his people. He actually created something like Trump's Army, or Army of Trump. I don't know, Trump's Army, which is really scary in of itself. He wants his people to go to the polling places to make sure people are not voting fraudulently. That's what this lie looks like. It looks like suppressing the vote. It looks like intimidating the vote. It looks like creating so much chaos that many of us just say, you know what, what's the use? He's going to cheat anyway. He's going to steal the election anyway. Or like his debate performance to say, oh, if this is what politics is, I want nothing to do with it. So I think, as I see it, I think the whole purpose of screaming voter fraud when they know it's not true is in order to suppress the vote. And hang with me a second. We're going to talk about that. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson and passed overwhelmingly by both the House and the Senate, prohibited racial discrimination in voting. And some of you might be like, in 1965, but the 15th Amendment giving blacks the right to vote passed way before that. Why did we need a Voting Rights Act in 1965? Because while there was a constitutional amendment that gave black men the right to vote, individual states were putting up barriers to allowing black men to vote. Some of these barriers were outright violence. Once black people showed up, or black men showed up to the ballot to vote, they would give them bogus reasons. Oh no, the election was yesterday, or oh no, you missed it, it was 3 hours ago. And then when the person, the voter, the black voter protested, he got beat or tear gassed or something like that. Some of the other things that states put into place were literacy tests. And because of the history of oppression of black people, slaves were not allowed to read in our country. And then further, after the end of slavery, education wasn't readily available to blacks and former slaves and former slave children. It was a lot harder still for them to get educated than it was for whites. They put literacy tests in place in order to vote. And if you didn't pass the literacy test, you couldn't vote. So that was another way to keep blacks from voting. There were poll taxes. Everybody knows about poll taxes. And sometimes a black voter would show up at the poll to vote and be told that in order to vote, they had to recite the entire Constitution. Can you recite even one amendment or even the preamble of the Constitution? So the point is, they were asking black voters to do what not white voters, like no one could do. So even educated black people were not allowed to vote because of these restrictions that the different states put into place. Once the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, within a couple of years, it didn't take very long at all. Once that was passed, black voter registration just went through the roof. And within a few years, black voter participation was almost as equal as white voter participation, meaning percentages of the population. So blacks really grabbed onto that and said, yes, we can vote now, and so their registration went through the roof. And in a democracy in which all men and women are created equal, that's a good thing, right? Well, no, wrong. Fast forward. We're going to fast forward a whole bunch of years. Let's fast forward to Barack Obama getting elected. In 2008, Barack Obama got elected by a landslide of African American, Latino, poor working class voters. So for the first time in American history, a quarter of the voting population were non-whites. And this was great. This was showing the new demographics of the United States, that, we had our first black president, that people who didn't come out to vote before were coming out to vote, and this is great, right? This is a wonderful thing for democracy and America, right? Wrong. Like so much of the history I have talked about, especially when it comes to the white establishment and white supremacy in the United States, that the election of Barack Obama, the showing up of so many non-white people scared the crap out of the white status quo establishment, old school white male Republicans, and they decided something had to be done about it. That democracy working, that our democratic institutions working, that allowing and giving non-white people the ability and the excitement about coming out to vote, they decided they needed to put a stop to that. No, we can't have any of that, they said. So what happened? When the Republicans in this country, mostly the white Republicans, especially the white Republicans in power, saw this, they decided that they had to do something. They were freaking out that they were going to be losing power. The demographic change in the United States was going to take away the power, take the power out of the hands of the established white Republican Party. And they decided they had to do something. And so with the help of the Koch brothers and 30 other multi-millionaires in the Republican Party, they joined forces together under a political organization that the Koch brothers already had called Americans for Prosperity, and they started the Red Map Project. And what's the Red Map Project, you might ask? The sole purpose of this project, and these millionaires and the Koch brothers dumped millions of dollars into this project. Their whole goal was to change key states that were run by Democrats into Republicans. Targeted, I think 30 states it was, that they needed to flip into Republican power, change the voting power of the United States. So they dumped millions of dollars into campaigns to smear Democratic state lawmakers in 30 states. And guess what? Do you remember what happened? It worked. Because in 2010 midterm elections, we saw a landslide bigger than we have ever seen of these state Democratic seats turning Republican. And then, so Obama became a president in 2008. And in the midterm election, everything, the House, the Senate, and a lot of the state legislators became Republican. It was a huge red wave. So this Koch brother, you want to talk about millionaires and you want to talk about who really has power in this country. Koch brother, along with 30 millionaires. Oh, okay, it was 30 millionaires, so not 30 states. 20 states. It was 20 states that they wanted to turn red. And this is the power of wealthy white Republican millionaires. They were able to put out so many smear ads against the sitting Democrats that they were able to flip, 700 seats. They were able to flip 700 seats at the state and local, at the national and state levels from blue to red. And this was in direct response to people, non-white people, people of color coming out to vote for Obama. Right? They were freaking out. They were losing power. They saw the shift, the change in America. I think it's been shown that, America is becoming less white demographically. I mean, brown and white and, Latino and African Americans are starting to take up, and Asian Americans are starting to take up more of the population. And this was embodied in the election of President Obama, and they freaked out. And they took back a bunch of seats through, what else? Money. Because that's how money talks, right? Bunch of smear campaigns. So 700 seats they got, including North Carolina, and North Carolina becomes a pretty big player in voter suppression. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. Part of the strategy, part of their thinking behind this, so it was a multi-pronged plan to take control back from the non-white voters who elected Obama. The first step was to get those seats, to flip all those seats, to take over control of all of these states that had formerly been democratically controlled. So that was the first step. And part of the reason they needed to do it in 2010 was because in 2011, these state legislatures were going to be responsible for redrawing district lines according to the 2010 census results. They wanted Republican control to redraw district lines. In other words, to allow gerrymandering. We'll get to that in a minute. Oh, no, we're already there. So the gerrymandering began in a tactic called packing and cracking. So packing and cracking, and basically it just means that they move stuff around in order to benefit them. The party lines, actually take a look at this in Texas, what they did, a very rural area in northern Texas, which was all white voters. They decided they were going to make the line of that district dip all the way down into a major city, Houston, so that they could grab Hispanic voters and change the outcome of the election in that district. So the gerrymandering began. And then once the gerrymandering was complete, they started voter restriction laws in all of these states that are now Republican controlled. They started introducing bills in these state legislatures to really make it more difficult for people to vote. And, I find this intriguing on so many different levels and disturbing. Democracy spoke. Democracy was working. People of all races, colors, religions, socioeconomic statuses, the poor, the rich, everybody went out to vote for Obama. And it worked. We had the highest non-white turnout ever. And the response to that from the Republican Party was to start figuring out ways to suppress the vote. And that's where we still are today. And that's why I'm talking about this, because like I always say, history matters. In Wisconsin, for example, one of the bills that was introduced to the new Republican state legislature was a bill that said if you don't have a state driver's license in order to vote, you need to have a birth certificate or a passport, social security number, and proof of state residency. Can you imagine? I mean, even for me, that's a lot of hoops to jump through to be able to vote. In a democracy, it should be as easy as possible to vote. We shouldn't be making it harder for people to vote. And laws like this, photo ID, not everybody has a photo ID. Not everybody can get to the DMV, and not everybody has a birth certificate. Not everybody knows how to get a birth certificate if you don't have a birth certificate. There's a cost involved in getting a birth certificate if you don't have it. I had to replace mine a few years ago to get my passport. And, it's a process. Not everybody can do that. Think about the elderly who no longer drive. They don't have a valid state license because they don't drive anymore. They don't need it. Think about the disabled. Think about the poor people who are working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. And in order to get an ID, they have to go to DMV during their hours, Monday through Friday, which is when they're probably working. They're not open on Saturdays. It might sound to you, the people who think, yeah, voter ID, yes, we should absolutely have voter ID. You have to have an ID to blah, 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 blah. Why shouldn't you need an ID to vote? Well, because it puts undue hardship on certain people, not the rich, not the people who can, easily take an afternoon off and go to DMV, not the people who can pay somebody or, who can easily afford to take a day off work or whatever. This puts undue hardship usually on non-white people and poor people. Here's what I think, as I see it. One other thing. We're putting these laws in place, these voter restriction laws in place, with almost zero evidence of voter fraud. We are putting a fix on a problem that doesn't exist. When you show up to vote, you have to verify your address, I think, right? They ask you your address, and I think you have to verify it. At least it seems like I had to. Yeah, they ask you your address, you have to verify it. And you have to sign something, and then your signature gets validated later. It's not like there are no protections against fraud in the current system. So here's how I see it. If a state wants to say, okay, we don't trust that process. We don't trust the process we've had in place for decades or hundreds of years. We don't trust that anymore, even though there's zero evidence that it's been a problem. So we're going to require everybody to have a photo ID, which is, again, really about ensuring a lot of people of a certain demographic aren't going to be able to vote. If that was really, if they really just wanted to ensure legitimacy or efficacy of the voting process, why not, when you register to vote, you send in a picture or you take a picture, and then at the voting, when you go to check in, they have a picture of you and they verify the picture. Why not do that? That takes the burden off the person who may not have a state-issued license. Native Americans are a great example of that as well. They don't even have like regular addresses because they live on reservations. There's a lot of problems with the voter ID law. So if that, again, there are other options. If that's really about making sure the voter is who they say they are, there's other options to do it that nobody is looking at. Or why don't you just give everybody a state ID for free? They're not doing that either. So again, if it was really about ensuring voter safety or guarding against voter fraud, there are other ways to go about it that doesn't put undue hardship on the voter, but they're not looking at those. Okay? Let me say that again. If it was really about ensuring the integrity of the voting process, there are other ways they could do it. A photo ID, a photo, a face recognition or something like that at the voter place. There are poll workers there anyway who are checking you in. How hard would it be to put your picture next to your name and they can make a visual validation of who you are? They could totally do that. They could give everybody free state licenses, and yet this is not what they're doing. And instead, they're putting the onus on the voter, and especially on poor, older people of color, traditionally Democratic voters. So besides, this red mapping project, the Americans for Prosperity, bankrolled by the Koch brothers and other millionaires, in addition to the gerrymandering that they wanted to do once they got control and voter restriction laws. They also then, did you know this? Fascinating stuff. Their next step in making sure that we don't have a replay of somebody like Obama getting elected because so many non-white people showing up at the polls, they decided that they were going to target gutting the Voting Rights Act. We all heard about this. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. Did you know it was bankrolled by the Koch brothers and other millionaires? All part of this red mapping project, Americans for Prosperity? Yep, it was bankrolled by the Koch brothers. So why? You might want to ask why. Well, a lot of the northern states were able to change their voting laws freely because it was up to the states, and within the Constitution they were allowed to make certain changes. However, because the South was so problematic in giving voting rights to African Americans in the early part of the century, when the Voting Rights Bill of 1965 was passed, there was a certain section that said that southern states, because of their history, southern states were not allowed to make changes to their voter registration process or their voting rights processes without first going through the Department of Justice. So the Koch brothers and his millionaire friends decided they wanted to change that. So they bankrolled a court case, took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, called Shelby County versus Holder, and in June 2013 the Supreme Court struck down the Voter Rights Act, saying that it was unconstitutional to make southern states have to go to the Department of Justice in order to change their voting laws. Yep, open the door wide open, and just as a side note, RBG voted against this. She said, no, I don't think it needs to be changed. So, what happened when the Supreme Court struck this down in 2013? Well, predictably, many states immediately changed their voting laws and started implementing mandatory state ID, shortening their early voting cycle. So, in one state, for example, I think it was North Carolina, so their early voting window had been 17 days. They changed it to 10 days. They had on the books early voter registration, or what was it called? Pre-registering for 16 and 17-year-old. They cut that out because we don't want young people voting. You know, of course, when they turn 18, we don't want young people because they vote Democrat. They took away same-day registration in their state. So here's the problem with taking away same-day registration. Oh, did I talk about purging? Okay, let's talk about voter roll purging. So it is important to clean up voter polls every once in a while. That's for sure. You want to make sure, like I said in the last video, people who've moved out of state are no longer on the voter roll. So it is important to clean the list every once in a while. But some states are taking it so far as to purge voters from the rolls for simple things like a Ms. MS instead of a Mrs. If one says Ms. and one says Mrs., nope, we're going to throw it out. If there's one letter wrong in a street name, if one number is off in a street address, if it says ST period instead of street. Some of the most ridiculously minuscule errors, they are deciding to purge voters from the rolls. And again, it has been predominantly African American voters, people of color. It's been predominantly people they don't want voting. People of color, poor people, young people, etc., that have been targeted in these purges, these voter purges. Okay, so back to the problem with eliminating same-day voter registration. Let's say that you were purged from the roll and didn't know it, okay? And I think I'm going to talk about this in a minute, about exactly the process for that and how it was done by one group. And you get to a poll, you don't know that you've been purged. So you go to vote on election day, you stand in line for 3 hours to get it to vote. You get up there and you're not on the thing. They can't find you when you try to check in. And you're like, well, wait a minute, I'm a registered voter. And they say, nope, sorry, you're not here anymore. And later you find out that you've been purged, but you weren't notified, you didn't know about it. And because there is no same day registration, you can't vote. That's it. You can't vote. You're not here. Sorry, don't know what happened. It's not our fault. It's not our problem. You can't vote. And that's exactly what happened to one woman that they showed in this documentary, Rigged, and I'm sure it happens to millions of people, maybe tens of thousands of people all over the country. And you might think, oh, these are just measures that they have taken, they're not calculated. They just want to make elections safer. This has nothing to do with making sure certain people, certain demographics don't vote. Well, that's not true. There is evidence again that shows that the early voting thing, for example, changing the 17-day early voting to 10-day. There is evidence that shows that the people who enacted this, the state legislatures, actually did the research to find out demographically, when do African Americans vote, when do Hispanic Americans vote, how do they vote, who do they vote for. They found that both of these groups predominantly vote democratically. They predominantly vote the first week of early voting. 70% of non-white voters showed up the first week of early voting to cast their ballots. And so what did they do? They wiped out that first week of early voting. They changed it from 17 to 10 days. You think that's a coincidence that they just went from 17 to 10? That's kind of random, right? They found that, again, 70% of those voters voted the first week of early voting, and so they just got rid of that first week of early voting. So when you look at history, when you look deeper, when you just stop listening to what you hear in the news, you start finding that things are a little bit more complex than they appear to be. This whole thing about voter fraud, when you've got efforts like this to ensure certain populations don't vote, you gotta start wondering what's really going on. And all of this just miraculously started appearing after Obama got elected. We never heard about voter fraud being an issue before 2008 or 2010. And this is the next thing that the Koch brothers red mapping project were doing in order to suppress the votes. They started a campaign led by the Voter Integrity Project, which started spouting over and over and over again high incidences of voter fraud, which were out and out lies. But all of a sudden, this voter fraud talking point started appearing all over the news, all over right-wing Republican news conferences and just became this, like the Red Scare. It was like McCarthy's Red Scare. Oh my God, voter fraud. Everybody's doing voter fraud. When in fact, again, and it's interesting when you watch the documentary, when people are really pressed on this, when lawmakers are pressed on the incidence of voter fraud, yeah, there's widespread voting fraud in my district. And the interviewer says, well, we did the research and we found 9. A lot of them haven't been found yet. Or something. I mean, seriously, this is what they say. So this talking point, this propaganda about voting fraud had to be put out in order to justify all of the voting restriction things that they were putting into place. Because the ACLU, the NAACP, and all kinds of civil rights leaders and Democrats are screaming, why are you doing this? Why? It clearly looks like voter suppression. It clearly looks like you're just trying to keep certain people from voting. And they're like, no. Oh, no, we're protecting the elections because there's so much voter fraud. That's the talking point they came up with. And part of it was through the Voter Integrity Project, which is an all-out lie. Saying that non-citizens are voting. Oh, they're bussing in people from Mexico to vote for Hillary. Lie. Zero proof. Oh, people are voting twice. Okay, like 9 out of a billion. 9 out of a billion. Does that really justify all the voter suppression tactics and laws they're putting into place? No, it doesn't. So in the words of one person in this documentary, they're fixing a problem that isn't broken. So they need to be able to justify it. And they have justified it by saying that there is widespread voter fraud, and there isn't. Stacey Abrams even was talking about it in this documentary, and she said, they don't believe there's voter fraud. They don't think so. They know there's no voter fraud, but they need to make you believe there is so that they can justify their tactics for holding on to power. And that's really what it is. It's a power grab. Old school white male Republicans are terrified of losing power, and they're willing to do anything. Gerrymander, lie to you, inflate numbers, just they're making stuff up. They think we're stupid. Because we are. As Americans, we're lazy. We don't bother to look beyond the talking points. We don't bother to dive into the research. We don't bother. And then we've let their money brainwash us so much that even when we are faced with facts, we don't believe them. So I used to be in advertising. Many of you know I'm a marketer, but first I was in advertising. Hated it. Liked marketing much better. It's a much more honest profession. But advertising 101. When I was selling advertising for a newspaper, what we always told people was like, you'd go into a business and they're like, all right, I want to buy an ad. You can't buy one ad. Nobody is going to buy from you with one ad. You need repetition. Repetition changes people's minds. If you say something enough times, people will start to believe it. No matter what that is, and just look at Trump and look at the Republican Party over the last 6 years, and you will know that that is right. Say something enough times and people will start to believe it. Why do you think like Budweiser spends billions of dollars on advertising? They're on billboards, they're on TV, they're on radio, they're in sports, they're everywhere. Repetition is what sells people. Marketing, on the other hand, is much gentler and kinder. It's about getting to know your audience, really, and about just being authentic, whereas advertising is just beating them over the head. Beating them over the head with a message. That's really what advertising, and I hated it. That's what it is. If you say something enough, people will start to believe it. In fact, when I used to do seminars for my business, when I was a marketing consultant, I used to talk about that. I used to talk about how, being up late at night and watching these crazy infomercials. Oh, you need this, widget. It'll change your life. And the first time you watch it, you're like, oh my God, that's crazy. Who would buy that crap? I don't know. And then, you see it 100 times and all of a sudden you're like, I think I might need one of those. How many of you have done that? That's what the Republican Party is doing to you. With this whole election fraud, rigged election. They are the ones who are rigging the election through voter suppression and gerrymandering. They are the ones who are rigging the election, and they want you to think they are doing that to protect you from the other. Blacks, Hispanics, poor, young college kids. It's true. Couple things. Okay, so that brings us to where we are today and back to the stories that are currently in the news. In addition to the Texas governor who is pulling away the boxes where people can drop their ballots, now I've given you some historical context into how there has been a history of voter suppression and how, in the absence of real voter fraud, does that move make sense? No, it doesn't. There is no voter fraud. 9 out of a billion. That is not voter fraud. So then why is this governor really taking away all the ballot boxes? Why? Because if you put one ballot box in an area the size of Rhode Island, poor people who maybe can't afford to pay the gas aren't going to be able to get to the ballot box to drop their ballot. People who work 2 jobs aren't going to be able to take time off work to drive 5 hours to drop off their ballot. Moves like this prevent anyone really but white rich people from voting. It's true. So just to give you an example of this, again, how the system has been rigged, I'm going to go ahead and say that word, over the last couple of years. Between 2016 and 2018, over 17 million names were purged from voter rolls across the United States. 17 million names were purged from voter rolls. Sure, some of that was legitimate. Some of the people died. Some of them moved. But then there were many, many thousands who showed up to vote and found out that they had been purged for really silly, ridiculous reasons. So make sure, I'm going to put a link below, make sure you check every week until the election and make sure you are still registered to vote. Oh, one thing I wanted to say about that. So if they were going to purge you, don't you think they would notify you somehow that if they're going to do 17 million names off of voter rolls, don't you think that they have a responsibility to let you know? Why didn't they? Well, this voter integrity group, one thing that they did is they sent out letters to the voters and said, okay, we're purging you. We need to verify your address. We're purging you. They sent it to the address on file with a do not forward on it, return to sender. So if that person moved, they had no way of knowing. They never got it. They didn't know. Is that really doing due diligence? Is that really ensuring democracy runs democratically? It doesn't sound like it to me. So today, and Trump and things that are going on in the news that I originally wanted to talk about, a couple things is, did you know that any citizen can walk up to any voter in a voting location and challenge their legitimacy to be able to cast a vote? In many states, that's still on the books. And of course, that goes back to Jim Crow. And those laws are on the books in many states. They were enacted in the early 1900s, and they were part of the Jim Crow laws to make sure African Americans, blacks, were not allowed to vote. And they are still on the books today. And Trump knows that. So in addition to Trump calling on an army to show up at polls, which is illegal, different states have different rules about that. They actually have to apply to be poll watchers. Proud Boys can't just show up armed and just start harassing people in line. There are rules and regulations that go into that. And another recent example of voter intimidation is in Michigan, where a bunch of African American voters around, I think it was the Detroit area, were getting these robocalls saying that don't vote by mail, because if you vote by mail, all of these organizations, including law enforcement, including credit card companies, and the CDC are going to get your information. Law enforcement might be able to track you down. Credit card companies might be able to come after you for debt. And the CDC is going to target you for mandatory vaccinations. So do not vote by mail. These are real robocalls that went out to real voters, mostly African Americans, in a specific area code in Detroit, which is like 90% African American. They know that African Americans don't really like being surveilled very much. There's a history of issues around that in this country, and so it was an effort to intimidate African American voters into not voting. And so what happened is the Attorney General filed an investigation and found that they were right-wing Trump supporters who sent out these calls, and they are illegal. This is voter intimidation. You're not allowed to do that. These calls apparently went out in multiple states. I think they said over 80,000 calls were made. I'll put a link to a playlist of the videos. This was a Rachel Maddow report. I'll put a link to in the video description so you can listen to it yourself. But basically the margin that Hillary lost, I think, this area of the country was like 10,000 voters. And they targeted 12,000 voters with these robocalls. So things like this very much can affect an election. And this is just another example of voter intimidation. It's interesting, these two guys were also under investigation for trying to hire people to say that to claim that they were sexually harassed by Pete Buttigieg, by Fauci. I mean, these guys ended up having a long history of crime, pro-Trump crime, to smear candidates and to support Trump, and so now they are charged with felonies. They were found in this, and of course they're saying it's all lies, even though one of the phone numbers traced back to this guy's personal phone number. But that is another example of voter intimidation. In addition to Trump's army showing up at voting places, we're going to see what's going to happen on Election Day. With Trump's army showing up, harassing people, challenging their legitimacy to vote. How much do you want to bet they're going to be calling out people of color and not whites, probably? So, in closing, let me just say one more thing. Prior to 2008, prior to the President Obama being elected, there were 2 states with strong voter ID laws on the books. 2 states. And after 2008, there was an explosion, mostly in areas with emerging voters. That's the poor, people of color, etc., the more democratic areas. All of a sudden, after Obama was elected, we started seeing more voter restrictions, tighter voting laws in areas that were mostly Democratic, people of color, etc. So you have to ask, there has not been an increase in voter fraud. There has not been any almost 0.0002% voter fraud. And yet we're seeing an explosion of laws and bills to prevent people or to make it harder for people to vote. So again, no matter what you think, you have to ask why. Why? Okay, as I see it, like I said before, the Republicans are losing control and they know it. The minority in this country is losing control. And so they are doing everything they can to retain that control. And the people who are in power have the power. And so they're not stopping at anything to retain that, including gerrymandering, including lying to the American people and using whatever mouthpiece they have, which at this time happens to be the President of the United States, to spread propaganda and lies about voter fraud. There is no voter fraud. What there is voter suppression. That is the only voter fraud, the election fraud, preventing people from voting. Trump calling his supporters to show up at polling places to intimidate voters. The other tool that they have is chaos. By making us be so sick and tired of the childish, lying chaotic circus that's going on in this country, their hope is that so many of us are going to be so sick of it all that we're just not going to vote at all, which is exactly the opposite of what we need to do. You have to vote. It's a responsibility. Being an American is not just a right, it is a responsibility. Please vote. And please check your voter registration often to make sure you're still on the polls, you're not purged. Encourage everybody you know to vote. Encourage everybody you know to share. Call your state legislatures, the states that are at risk of messing with the elections through the bills and the commissions that they're going to pass in these states, these swing states, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, Virginia, Wisconsin. Make sure you keep an eye on your state legislatures, know what they're doing, know how your electors for your electoral college are chosen. Make sure that they don't change that. Get active, get involved, contact your state legislatures when they do something that you know is anti-democratic or is suppressing the vote or intimidating voters. Get involved, make sure you vote. Again, there is no voter fraud. It's ridiculously small. The fraud, the election rigging that we are seeing is by the people who are scared to death that they're losing power. The white millionaires of the Republican Party, okay? And Trump is their mouthpiece. Don't believe anything he says. And if you do show up to vote, I don't know, have a plan. I'm starting to think that I used to do clinic defense in the 90s. That was where I would stand up to the anti-choice protesters in line at Planned Parenthood to ensure that women who needed health care could get it safely. I'm starting to think that we need a nationwide movement of poll place defense against people, Trump supporters who might show up. So I don't know. Anybody out there know anything about that? We need poll defense. I used to do clinic defense. We need poll place defense. And cast your ballot early. If you're in a state where you could check to make sure your ballot was counted, make sure you do that. This election is going to be crazy. It's going to be scary. And remember that the Republicans are desperate. They're going to do everything in their power to retain power. They're desperate. And we, as a people, need to stand up and fight for our democracy. Okay? I hope you found this helpful, informative, interesting. Thank you all so much for being here. Take care, vote, help others vote, get involved. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Okay? I will see you soon. In the meantime, be happy, be free, and be kind. I will see you soon. Take care. We're almost there. Hopefully, big change coming soon.